Okay, I'll now show you how to use a TI 84 calculator, and this works for pretty much all versions of the 84, I would guess, and for the TI 83, and the TI 89 has a similar sort of capacity to it. But and let me say this: if you watched the section 1.3 video, it showed you the tabulations of the summary statistics, which can be very tedious, and it's really not the emphasis of the course. Doing a bunch of calculations by hand, and by the way, neither is using your calculator. All right. And very typically students will say to me after the exam, gee, I didn't use my calculator that much. And we're going to be using the calculator a lot during the year, though, in order to do a bunch of problems. And you say, well, what is the emphasis of the course? The emphasis of the course is to conceptually understand what this stuff means, all right, and to be able to interpret it in context. And so that's what we're going to be practicing. Our calculator is a great tool for understanding that, but understand it is just that. It is a tool to understand this stuff conceptually and to be able to explain it. So you should always be thinking about that, is what is the concept behind this that's going on. Anyway, having said that, we'll be talking about that throughout the year. I want to show you how to do chapter 1 with your calculator. So the main part of chapter 1 in regards to quantitative data, so this is the same problem we did on the chapter 1.3 notes, where it says the number of complaints each week received over a 10-week period by a company are shown below. Find the summary statistics, create a dot plot, and describe the distribution. So it's clearly quantitative data, and with this quantitative data, very typically we're going to use our calculator to find the summary statistics and also to create a box plot and a histogram. So the summary statistics are these things we listed down here in section 1.3. So we've got our our main measures of our measures of center, our main measures of center, which, as we talked about, are the mean and the median. The mean, in essence, what we think of as the average. You add them up and divide by the number of numbers. The median's the number in the middle. If there's two numbers in the middle, you average them. Then we have our measures of spread, as we talked about in the 1.3, and we got the range, which is just the biggest minus the smallest. We've got the interquartile range, Q3 minus Q1, and then we've got the standard deviation. The standard deviation is, in essence, intuitively, it is the average amount the points vary from the middle. It's the average amount the points vary from the middle. So we're gonna find those numbers using our calculator. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna enter our data into a list. And so first of all, we'll turn the calculator on by hitting the on button right there. So we hit on, and that turns the calculator on, right like that. And so then to enter the data into a list, we're gonna use our favorite button, which is the stat button right there. You see it? Right there, the stat button. So I hit the stat button, and it lists this menu there. And so we are going to go edit. So we hit edit to go to a list. Edit. There we go. There's our list. Now, by the way, if there had been something in our list and we needed to clear it out, let's just say there had been some random data that had been in there before. So there's data in list 1. What you would do to clear that is this. Don't use the delete button, because the delete button has the potential to delete your list. And that's a problem. And if you delete a list, just bring me in your calculator and I can fix it. But don't delete a list. We're going to use the clear button. So you highlight the top. Use these arrow keys to go to the top, and you highlight the top. You then hit clear and down arrow, or clear and enter would work, and it clears a list. But don't hit delete, or it deletes the whole list. Okay, so anyway, so now I'm to the list. Now I'm going to enter these numbers, and so I carefully enter them. So I hit 2 and hit the enter button. The enter button is in the lower right hand corner right there. So 2 and then enter to end that. And so then I enter, so 5, enter 1, enter 9, enter 12, enter 4, enter 7, enter 3, enter 14, enter 8. There we go. And so there they are. I know there's 10 numbers in there because it has the little place setting right down there in the command line. And so let me just check them. Always check them, make sure you get them. You entered them right quick. So 12, 9, 1, 5. Very good. And so I've entered them to a list. Now we'll come up with our summary stats. And so this is what we do to come up with our summary stats. We're going to hit, and let me zoom in a little bit now that I've entered it, so hopefully maybe you can see this a little better. But So there we are. Okay, so now what we're going to do to find our summary stats, we're going to hit the stat button again right there. Hit the stat button, and we're going to go to calculate. So I arrow over to calculate. We're using one variable stats. We'll never use two variable stats, by the way. So one variable stats is what we hit. So we hit enter on that. Boom. Now we put list 1 there. Let's pretend that it didn't have list 1 there. Okay, the way you put list 1 there is by hitting second and the 1 button. Notice right above the 1 button there's an L1. So if you hit the second button, that blue button, second and then 1, it puts list 1 there. The frequency needs to have a 1 in it, or it needs to be blank the whole year, pretty much, except for this one special problem in probability. But aside from that, all year long, make sure your frequency list is blank. Okay, just like that. If there was, let's pretend it said list 2 there, which I put there by hitting second and 2. I don't want anything there. Hit clear. There we go. And so then all you got to do to get your summary stats is calculate, and boom, that's it. And I know you're saying, we just watched the 40-minute video on how to do all that by hand, and you could do it that quickly. Yes. But you really sort of need to be able to do it by hand. It leads to a better intuitive understanding. They could ask you about it, but this certainly makes you thankful for your calculator. So there's the mean. So our mean is 6.5, and so there's our mean, our measure of center. Okay, and then our median, if you scroll down, now that's just the sum of the x's, sigma of the x's, that's sum of the x squareds, which we're really never going to use that. There's the s, our standard deviation. Okay, this sigma is also a standard deviation, but we will never really use that number. Okay, we always use the s number, s sub x. It is a sample standard deviation, then it's a population standard deviation, but for reasons I won't get into, we always use the s for our standard deviation. So our standard deviation in this case is 4.3, so it's approximately 4.301, let's say. Certainly want to have, I would say a good rule of thumb is at least 3 or 4 significant digits like that. All right, so that's that. Now, and then we can arrow down. I'm hitting the arrow button to get my other summary stats, namely my 5-number summary that was used in a box plot. The min, the lower quartile, Q1, Q2, the median, Q3, the 75th percentile, otherwise known as the upper quartile, and then the maximum value. So I can write these over here. And so this one, the median is 6. And then the IQR, that measure of spread, it's Q3 minus Q1, so it's 9 minus 3. So that is equal to Q3 minus Q1, and that is equal to 9 minus 3, and that's 6. And the range is just the max minus the min, 14 minus 1, which is 13. So that is certainly a very quick way to get your summary stats. And if you were describing this data, you would say, well, the data is centered around a mean of 6.5, standard deviation of 6. All right, the spread is, it has no outliers, as we'll talk about in a second. The spread is described by the range of 13, IQR of 6, standard deviation of 4.301. And then we'll talk about the shape. Now, by the way, note that the mean is bigger than the median. Okay, that means that's evidence that it's skewed to the right, because the mean on when the shape is skewed to the right, it typically pulls the mean toward it. So that's a little clue there. So that's how you get your summary stats using your calculator. Now let's get a box plot. And so this is how we're going to do our graphs. So the way you can do your graphs using your calculator, and thus a graphing calculator, is using our stat plots right there in the upper left. And so notice it's above the y is equal to button, so you got to hit second. So you go second stat plot, and it takes you to your stat plots. And so you notice we've in essence got 3 of them there, and notice this plot 1 is turned on, that's the one we're going to use, and then these 2 are turned off. And so that's good. You don't want really more than 1 turned on at a time, unless you're plotting 2 things at the same time, which we're not doing right now. But so I'll just hit enter on plot 1. And since I'm only plotting 1 thing, I would need to turn the others off if need be. But so I hit enter on that. Now, if it had been turned off like that, let's say if I go there and it's that, I got to turn it on. So I hit enter on the on button. And then here's my 6 kinds of graphs that we can graph with this calculator in regards to the stats. That first one is going to be a scatter plot, which we do in chapter 3. We'll never use that second one, but these are the two big ones for this chapter, and that is the histogram, that third one, and then the fourth one is what we call a modified box plot. And you notice there's little dots on the outside of the box plot, and those are where we would plot outliers. if there's outliers out there. And so that's the quickest way whether or not you can tell there's outliers, is that you would it would plot the outliers on the outside of your whiskers. And that's just a regular box plot that doesn't isolate outliers like that. But so in general, these are the two that we're going to use. So if we're going to make a box plot, what we'll do is we'll arrow over to that, and we hit enter on the modified box plot. So my X list is list 1, frequently needs to say 1 or it needs to be blank. And then that's just the mark we'll use, which is that. And then we hit, and so it's ready to go. So it's ready to graph. And so now what we'll do is we'll hit the graph button right there. So we hit, now, actually, I'm sorry, before that, we need to make sure there's nothing else that is graphing in your calculator. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quit out of this menu by hitting second quit, or second in the mode button. And I'm going to go to y is equal to, just to make sure there's nothing turned on there. And so there is another, so this is my y is equal to, my functions that are in here, and it's not turned on. If it hadn't been turned on, if you hit enter on the equal sign, it would turn that graph on, and it would graph, and it would kind of mess up my other graph, which I don't want to happen, and it'd take it longer to graph. So what I would do is I just hit enter on the equal sign, or you could just clear it out if you wanted, and that turns that graph off. And now, and you notice only plot 1 is highlighted. Plot 2 and plot 3 are not highlighted, so plot 1 is turned on. And so then I'm going to hit the graph button. So I just hit graph. And the last thing you have to do is you have to zoom it properly. And the way you do it is by hitting the zoom button, and it's zoom 9. Hit zoom 9, which is zoom stat. Zoom 9, boom, and it zooms it in for you. And there you go. You got yourself a box plot. And so you notice in this box plot, the right whisker is bigger than the left. So that's telling you it's skewed to the right. And like I said, when it's skewed to the right, it'll pull the mean bigger than the median. If it had been skewed to the left, let's say the left whisker was bigger, it'd pull the mean smaller. And then the other thing in regards to skewness is the box. Now this is pretty symmetrical in regards to, matter of fact, I think it's exactly symmetrical in regards to the box. But another evidence for right skewness if the right side had been bigger than the left, but it's not. But anyway, but now it's important whenever you graph an AP Stats that you don't just do it on your calculator, you have to write it on your piece of paper. So if it had said create a box plot on the AP Stats exam, it's really important that you actually draw this down. But a problem that occurs, you notice there's no numbers there to graph it, and we have to draw a scale. So what you can do is this, is you hit the trace button and it will tell you the scaling. So if you hit trace, notice it's this little thing is beeping on the median of 6, and then if I left arrow over, it gives me that Q1 is 3, and then like that. And so it tells you the scale. In other words, by hitting trace, you can arrow over and you can get those numbers. So that's how you do a box plot. Now, what I mean by a modified box plot in regards to an outlier, so that's telling you there's no outliers because there's no dots on the outside of it. So let's say, for instance, we make up something that's an outlier. So let's say, for instance, let's go and change the data. So if I go stat and edit, and I go down here, and this 14, let's pretend it was actually a 22, which is going to be an outlier. In other words, a really unusual value outside the pattern of the outliers. And in the last section, we had calculated that anything that's above 18 is going to be an outlier, so you can watch that video. So I know 22 is certainly an outlier. So now let's graph this and see what happens. And so I will go zoom 9, and notice that 22 number, it's an outlier, so it is plotted as a dot there, and then the whisker is going to the biggest number that's not an outlier, which in this case is 12. Okay, and so that is what we call a modified box plot, and that's the way I like to draw boxes. Outliers are very, very important, and so the quickest way to identify whether or not something's an outlier is draw a modified box plot and see if it graphs it as a dot out there. So anyway, but using the formula for it as we did in the last video isn't really that hard to do. You just got to multiply and add, subtract. But anyway, so that's how you do that graph. And then the last thing to be able to use your calculator in this section is to make a histogram. So there's a box plot. So to make a histogram, we'll go back to our stat plot. So I go second stat plot. I hit enter on plot 1, and the histogram is that one right there. that one right there. So I hit enter on that. And so there we go. So the histogram is highlighted. So it's going to graph a histogram. And so I will, and I already know there's nothing in y is equal to, but I always just, second quit and then go y is equal to. There's no other graph turned on. None of the equal signs are highlighted, and just nothing on plot 2 or plot 3. So it's ready to go. So I do graph and then zoom 9. Graph zoom 9. So, and by having these different graphs, each of them gives a little different picture of it. So this histogram is really clearly showing us that it's right skewed. It clearly, now right skewed means tail going to the right. So, which is going to pull the mean higher than the median. But it also shows us there's a gap there. So there appears to be a cluster of values here and then a gap there. Of course, when you're drawing this histogram, it's really important, first of all, that you actually draw it, that you just don't comment on it and say, well, it was on my calculator. You have to actually draw it on the paper, but you have to scale it. How do you come up with the scaling? By hitting the trace button. So if you hit trace, notice where this is beeping there. And so this is saying min of 1, max is 6.25. So that's telling you on this graph, on this bar, it goes from 1 to 6.25. And notice your n is 5. That's telling you that's the height of the histogram. It goes up to 5. So if I right arrow over on the next bar, well, this bar goes from 6.25 to 11.5. And it's n and 3. There's 3 values there. And there's going to be 1 value there and 1 value there. So that's how you get your, that is how, in essence, you get your scaling. And that's how you do a histogram with your calculator. Well, and that's pretty much what you need to know in regards to your calculator in Chapter 1.